graphic because, you know, you all don't read daily newspapers. And they see those readership figures going down, so they're trying like, well, let's make the paper smaller, and let's have more pictures, and let's do more entertainment, and you know, those kinds of things aimed at attracting younger people. Now, I happen to believe that younger people do want news and information. I think what you have mostly at newspapers is people 40, 50, and older trying to figure out what people under 35 want. So you've got a little bit of a disconnect. But some papers are trying some real creative things. But the bottom line is that there's less time for people to do long-form stories. The length of a broadcast newscast is shorter than it used to be. There are more ads. The number of pages in newspapers is less than it used to be. So those are some of the forces that make it hard to get stories like this out into the mainstream. So what we at The Reporter and other outlets like ours, I think, try to do is offer that alternative to people. And we often have folks from daily news or TV or radio, you know, report on our stories, you know, as a way, because they don't have the time to do a 3-month investigation of mortgage lending data, for instance.
Now, you spoke about like the profit considerations within this. With you working at a nonprofit and having experience at, you know, kind of, you know, developing your chops in the corporate media world, what are some of the differences in trying to, you know, get some of these stories out?
Well, I mean, the big difference on the business side is the fact that the revenue stream. I mean, in most media outlets, people don't understand that what determines how many pages are in the paper is not how much news there was. It's how many ads got sold. So the revenue streams are totally different, and you have to respond to advertisers. You know, when you see newspapers do these special sections on real estate or fashion or whatever, a lot of times those are thought up as advertising revenue generating activities. So that's one thing. Now on the nonprofit side, it's just a different kind of game you have to play. You've got to respond to the interests and the needs of foundations in our case, because we're largely foundation funded. But in terms of the coverage, I mean, I don't know how much it affects the differences in the coverage, except that at a nonprofit, I think the focus is not necessarily as much on how many masses of people you're reaching, but perhaps the quality of the audience you're reaching and the type of audience you're reaching. I think it's hard for magazines like The Reporter to get much advertising revenue because we're not going to be in the Jewel. You know, we're not going to be on every grocery store rack in town. It's a very specialized kind of audience. That said, I will just add that I think where you do see some growth in the media is among magazines and media outlets like ours, these kinds of alternative news sources. They're actually getting some more subscribers, particularly since the war in Iraq started. People are really interested in those sources of news.
Explain to the people who may not be familiar, like, what you mean by diversity. Do you mean like more black faces on newspapers, or is it something more?
It's definitely something more, because when you look at mainstream media today, you have the quote-unquote diversity. Quota is being met. You'll have a black male or a black female, white male, white female. You may have an Asian on. You know, so we're not talking about the face of it, because if that person who's giving the news doesn't have the independence to search out and really get a lot of independent voices into the media, then it's all for naught. And, you know, ironically, today, even black journalists are kind of frustrated with just that part of diversity in the media outlets. But I'm talking about a lot of independent sources. You got to have some independent black-owned, Latino-owned, Asian-owned media outlets who can really go out there and search out and bring to light some of the great stories that are out there. Though good and bad, that affect our community, and that will give us a warning and give us hope and inspiration at the same time. You know, a lot of times we get the warnings, but we don't get those inspirational stories out there who can really uplift folks.
The thing you have to remember about those ASNE goals is that they have set those goals and then pushed those goals back like a number of times because they haven't actually really met the goals the way that they've wanted to. I think we have to sort of do it from a bunch of different angles. I mean, I think shows like this are a great start. I mean, I think this is an excellent example of the kinds of things people can do to just get different perspectives and different voices out there. But I do think we need to support, you know, Mary Mitchell at the Chicago Sun-Times, for instance. She is an editorial board member of a major daily newspaper and has a voice in what the paper supports and doesn't support. And instead of sending her hate mail because of some column we didn't like that she did about, you know, Reverend Jackson or something like that, we need to tell her when she's doing a good job.
Right.
And we need to tell her bosses when she's doing a good job so that they'll recognize how valuable she is. And we need to try to get more people like her in those newsrooms. So I think that, you know, giving young people of color opportunities to learn the business, to learn the craft, which we try to do at The Reporter and other places, which you're doing with this show, could be an avenue to people moving into some of these different outlets, because it does make a difference when there is a person of color at the table, when decisions get made, when stories get decided. And I would encourage people to not just think about being, you know, being reporters or being anchors or that kind of thing, but being producers, being editors, you know, being in those kind of behind-the-scenes managerial roles where you really can call the shots even more. So I don't think there's any one answer, I guess, to answer your question. I think we have to try a variety of venues and support black-owned and alternative media like The Defender. You know, maybe a younger person should get a column in The Defender, you know, as an example, you know, to just give that perspective. But I don't think I don't think it's a waste to try to get black people at the New York Times or the Washington Post either.
Aren't some journalists who are employed in these publications, aren't they aware of some of these processes?
Sure they are.
Why are they not taking on these?
They're not
in
allowed.
your opinion?
They're not allowed. They are not allowed.
Explain that process to our viewers. Is there like a direct censorship that they say, okay, you're not allowed, or is there a more subtle process?
Both. Both.
Elaborate.
Okay. We have owners like Disney that own Channel 7, ABC. They're some of the biggest polluters on the planet, and they use people in sweatshops across the world to create their caps, their T-shirts, you know, and all the stuff that attends a movie, whatever that means. All the paraphernalia that will go off with the movie. They're underpaying their workers, and they are doing some serious environmental degradation. Okay, we don't use Disney. We don't get Disney. So let's go to print. I can give you a wonderful story about my personal experiences as a freelance journalist. During the Vietnam War, I became more and more aware of the cover-up with Agent Orange and the damage it was doing and how little was being truly reported about the damage of Agent Orange. And I'm going to bring a parallel up to the Gulf War, okay? And what I did, I got a hold of a whole pile of papers that were from the EPA, the military, Department of Defense. We call it Department of Defense. Give me a break. We're going out there, we're defending nothing.
Right.
And the EPA, Department of Defense, and even the White House. And guess what? They were all indicative of the fact that they all knew how toxic dioxin was, how dangerous it was to be exposed to it, how you don't go near it unless you're totally and completely protected, etc. I brought this into the hands of then the executive editor of the Chicago Tribune, and I said, your coverage of this story is impossible. You are not telling the truth. What in the world is going on? Read these secret documents, stamped confidential, and he walked away. He walked away.
What do you think, as far as like, you know, the profit influence and the corporate influence within all forms of media, print, broadcast, increasingly on the internet? Is this so much a part of the system that, you know, it may never change? Because I'm not sure if we're going to get as much independent journalism within this system. Obviously, there'll be alternatives that was brought up, like you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But is there a way to kind of like, you know, maybe weed some of the corporate influence out of it, or is this what we're stuck with? And if so, what alternatives do, you know, common citizens have?
Well, I think that's a question that a lot of people in a lot of sectors of society are asking themselves.